Order, order. Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee inquiry into the government's new approach to addressing the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. And I would like to thank our witnesses for their attendance today. This is a busy week for veterans, starting as it did with our Victory in Europe commemorations on Monday and culminating tomorrow with the 80th anniversary of VE Day itself. So thank you very much for your time. Could we start with you saying who you are and what your role is? We'll start on the left.
I am Axel Schmidt, and I am the Advocacy Support Officer, or Manager rather, of the Ulster Human Rights Watch Advocacy Service.
Thank you. Chris?
I'm Chris Albiston, retired police officer here representing the Retired Police Officers Association.
David?
David Johnstone. I am the Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland, in post since the 1st of January. Did serve with the Royal Irish Regiment Army Reserve for 26 years, operational tour of Iraq in 2004.
Dave?
I'm Dave Holmes. I'm here to represent the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement, which in itself represents the group which I lead, which is Rolling Thunder UK, as well as 16 other veterans groups.
Thank you, Dave. David, in your submission, you note how critical it is that veterans feel their concerns around legacy proposals and that they're listened to. What's your view on the government's approach to the consultation thus far, and do you believe that veterans' voices are being heard?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's significant, just starting off today, that we're here this week, of all weeks, obviously marking and celebrating VE 80, ending of the Second World War. And I think it is poignant that when we consider how we rightly recognise and honour veterans from the Second World War for the price that they paid going to war on behalf of this country, that when you then compare how veterans in Northern Ireland are treated, I think there's a huge contrast there and a stark, marked difference. I actually had the pleasure of speaking with Captain John Goff. He's a 100-year-old veteran. He served in Operation Market Garden and is with him on Monday night. Amazing man, and rightly he was given plaudits and huge honour. I couldn't help thinking of Dennis Hutchings, who had 80-year-old, ill health, having served this country, having been sent to Northern Ireland by the then government lawfully. He then found himself in an elongated process of legal warfare, and obviously, as people know, died in a hotel room on his own. So I think there's something fundamentally flawed with how we approach legacy. In terms of engagement, I would definitely say that the Secretary of State and the government have been very open to having conversations. So I think they are hearing the views of veterans. I've had meetings with the Secretary of State. We've had some robust exchanges around some of the issues, but this door is open, and I know he has met with a number of veteran groups. I think there is, though, Chair, a difference between hearing the stories of veterans and their views and listening to what their feelings are. And I think that's where the divergence comes. I think there is a feeling that, irrespective of the views of veterans, that the government has a line of trajectory that is going down, irrespective of the views of veterans. So there's definitely a hearing. I'm not sure there's a listening. And if I could just make one more point, I think veterans in Northern Ireland have been encouraged by the Minister for Veterans and People, Al Carnes, someone who obviously has served in the military, a decorated military veteran himself. I had the opportunity of setting him down with some veterans in Northern Ireland, and he definitely, I think, both heard and listened. And certainly there was a feeling among the veterans that he gets it. He understands the complexity, but he understands the hurt, the pain that veterans are going through as they watch this legacy process play out.
Thank you, David. And Dave, what is your view on the government's approach to the consultation with veterans?
As David had said, it's one of the things that we feel that we have been heard. I've had meetings myself, along with colleagues with the Secretary of State, And yes, we sat there, we had a very good meeting, but when it came to the end of it, it became, as David had said, it became obvious that it was very much, yes, I've heard you, but it's not a case of we've been listened to. You know, I'm not saying by any means that lip service is being paid or anything like that, but it was, okay, thank you very much, this is what we're doing. You know, whether we'd made any difference at all or not, I don't know. I don't see any difference being made. And I was also, we were quite shocked that we actually had access that's to information that's in the public domain that he did not know about, which I found quite shocking.
Would you like to detail that?
The one thing in particular that stuck in my mind was the communication between the then Prime Minister Tony Blair and then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland John Reid. And in there is basically, I'm not quoting the line, this is off the top of my head, it basically says there is nothing in the agreement that is able to stop any prosecution of any of the security services, which was, that is one of the things that the veterans have always been very, very concerned about, was the feeling that they were deliberately thrown to the wolves. And that's the belief of the vast majority of those who served under our banner.
Thank you, Dave. Chris, and with regard to the voices of retired police officers, are they being listened to?
Well, at the risk of sounding like an echo, there's a difference.
You can say that, you can just say.
There's a difference between being listened to and action being taken on what is discussed. I have to say, Chair, that the Northern Ireland Office past and the Northern Ireland Office under the current government has always been very helpful, very keen to meet with us and hear our views. That's both at political level and at official level. So in terms of the present government, we have had very cordial meetings with Mr. Benn and with Baroness Anderson. And like many before them, they have expressed appreciation for the work done by the women and men of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, George Cross. But when it comes to doing what we would like them to do in terms of legacy, then it's not quite the same thing. And governments have other things to worry about than what retired police officers think. But we've been a little disappointed now for 25 years about the way that legacy is going. And I think, without straying too far away from the specific question, most people in Northern Ireland, and probably here as well, seem to agree that the way legacy has been handled so far this century has not been satisfactory. And one of the reasons why our association was one of the few groups to offer qualified support to the previous government when it was negotiating its way through the Legacy Act. One of the factors which influenced us was that something must be better than what's gone before. I think the problem is that unless you can get people to agree on what's the best way forward, then the people who don't like the proposals will chip away at it, and we'll be back to square one again, and we could end up with another 25 years of trying to do something about legacy. And incidentally, it's not just government here in Westminster and the Northern Ireland Office who have listened to us. We have regular meetings with politicians and opinion formers in Northern Ireland, two of whom are present in this room today that our association has had good meetings with. But again, whether those meetings were productive remains to be seen, I think, over the next few years, because we've had 25 years of not being very productive.
Thanks, Chris. Axel, what are your views on the government so far?
Our advocacy support service deals mainly with victims of terrorism. When I say mainly, essentially with victims of terrorism. And what I can say is that over many years, I think the voice of victims of terrorism have not really been heard in Northern Ireland. There is a major problem in relation to the legislation that applies to victims and survivors in Northern Ireland. We have the Northern Ireland Order 2006, which provides an interpretation of who a victim and survivor is. But this interpretation is so wide that it covers innocent victims as well as perpetrators. We have constantly advocated that this interpretation should be done away and by a proper approach to victims of survivors in relation to their troubles. And that is that we should apply the definition of victims of crime that is now enshrined in the law in the Justice Act 2015, and also this victim of crime definition applies to the rest of the United Kingdom. So if that approach was taken by the government, I think that will clarify many issues, and that would put things right in relation to how the security forces were confronted by terrorism and in fact were there to defend, protect human rights and also protect democracy in Northern Ireland. And if we had that approach, I think that would change tremendously not only the way we're going to deal with the legacy of the past, but also as far as in relation to the Independent Commission, but also the memorialization of the past. And if we have that approach, we will have a clear distinction of who were the perpetrators, who were the victims of terrorism, and therefore that will clarify how we approach all these issues and the outcome of the way the legacy of the past is going to be dealt with by the Independent Commission.
Thank you, Axel. David, your predecessor told the committee that he resigned as he felt that his office was being run by the NIO. What's your view on the independence of the office of the Veterans Commissioner?
Okay. Potentially where the legacy is in that, but yeah. So first of all, I'm pleased you've actually asked that because it gives me the opportunity to pay tribute to Danny. He deserves a lot of credit. I know he's very passionate about the veteran space and about supporting veterans. He did obviously start effectively this process. It's a brand new structure. He's the first commissioner, and he also came in during COVID, which just added a whole layer of complexity, for him and the staff. So I think he deserves huge credit for the building blocks he placed. And as I've said many times, he walked these shoes for over 4 years. I'm now in them. Regarding his frustrations, the first thing I did, Chair, when I started this role on the 1st of January was go and meet Danny for coffee. Because I'd heard different things floating around the space, if you like, about his views, and I wanted to hear directly from him, and we had a good conversation. In terms of his frustrations and his ultimate decision to resign, I wasn't there, so I don't know the rights and wrongs of how he felt about things, so I don't really think I can add anything or comment on his personal decisions. What I can say I've been in post now just over 4 months, and certainly I've had absolutely no impinging of my ability to work. I've had no contact from the NIO about anything operationally within the role. The two staff I have are excellent, they're very committed, and from my point of view, I think I've been quite robust in some of my public statements about the Secretary of State on legacy. We've had private conversations, I've had conversations with the NIO around legacy, and I think I've been very forthright in that, and there's been absolutely no attempt to put me in a straitjacket. I suppose time will tell, Chair, as it always does in life, but my experience to date is I knew the terms of reference when I was offered this role. I knew where the limits of exploitations were, and I was certainly satisfied that I'd be able to speak up for, to advocate for, and be a champion for veterans. If I felt I couldn't do that, or if I felt I was being curtailed, then I would not have taken the post. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, David. Gavin Robinson.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Holmes, can I ask you firstly to outline why you would be opposed to the reintroduction of inquests, and what impact you think the reintroduction of inquests will have on dealing with the legacy of the past?
The issue, we believe, with the inquests is they are looking at events that happened 40, nearly 50 years ago. Memories, everybody's memory is short. People who were there as time goes on, with conversations with other people, etc., their real memories become corrupted, not deliberately, but so you end up as people who are trying to give evidence, or we believe that people who try to give evidence after so many years, there is also some myth in there. There is some colouring of what happened and the circumstances, the times, and obviously their own beliefs come into that, depending on which side of the divide they may have been on. To push more, the inquests, I think, have run their time. When you look into it's very difficult, I think, to do the inquests and to do them properly. The inquests take a lot of time, where the events took a very, very short period of time to actually happen, and people did what they believed on what they, from a veteran's point of view, what they saw in front of them, the information they had, and they made decisions based on that. They made decisions based on belief, which is part of the rules of engagement. When you decide that you're going to take lethal action, that's not an easy thing to do. And that is the very, very last step when you have exhausted every other possibility in your head. And that is probably done in a matter of 1, 2, or 3 seconds. Wait any longer and somebody will die. If you're going to have to do that, there is no time for everything else. There is no time to consult with anybody. You have to make that decision. Now, the military are very, very highly trained, and they don't take that step easily. That is it is the final step. It's the step you don't want to take. You don't want to take life.
Okay.
The problem then is that's taken apart over a 6-month period, or whatever the time frame is on the inquest. A lot of the evidence that's presented is discovered afterwards, so there is hindsight in there. That is not known at the time, obviously. There's the coloration, as I say, of people's memories, and finally, when it comes to that, what comes out of it, it's somebody else's opinion of what happened at the time. Whoever is presiding over it, it is their opinion of what happened at the time. We see in over the last few inquests that have been done, the last ones that were remaining before they were stopped, that had to run through, and the ones just before there, decisions are made, and no, that was, you know, people's belief is being questioned. How can you question somebody's belief? It's just not possible. What somebody has in their head and what they see at that time, that is all there is. And then it's based on belief from that point onwards. And when you're talking about highly trained individuals, both from the military and from the police, their belief has to be believed, as it were. Finally, on that, Chair, with the inquests, they have a tendency, or can have a tendency, to lead to an investigation based on the findings of the inquest, and then potentially back to prosecutions, or at least, even if it doesn't become a prosecution, punishment by lawfare.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Schmidt, I'm going to ask you the same question about your view on the reintroduction of inquests, but just drawing on what Mr. Holmes said. There's been recent commentary around a number of inquests which highlight the fact that their role is to establish what happened, where it happened, when it happened, how it happened, and to whom it happened, but not why it happened. And there seems to be this encroachment into the why space, which is then leaving open further explorations of investigations that go beyond the balance of probabilities and into the realm of criminal thresholds for prosecution. What's Ulster Human Rights Watch view on the reintroduction of inquests, and your view on how they have been almost used as a preparatory tool for further prosecution opportunities?
Well, our approach has been a human rights approach to this issue. Clearly, the courts, the trial judge, and the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland both stated that it was not necessary to have inquest reinstated, or even to have simply inquest being done to abide and to conform to the European Convention on Human Rights. So taking that approach that has been taken by the courts and looking at what the court said in relation to inquest, they have stated that the Independent Commission has more powers than a coroner. So therefore, there is more to gain in going through the Independent Commission than to go through an inquest. The only issue that was raised in relation to not having inquest and being replaced by investigation carried out by the Independent Commission were in relation to the possibility for the next of kin to be involved in the process. My understanding is that the Secretary of State is going to introduce in the remedial order disposition that will enable the next of kin to take part in public hearings. Even there will be a possibility for the next of kin to have their own lawyers that will be funded by the Commission itself. So if we look at what is there coming from the courts and what is going to be done by the Secretary of State, there is no reason to reintroduce inquest.
Well, that's quite interesting. Some of the criticism around ICRIR and the need for inquests is what you've mentioned: next of kin participation, legal representation, an independent judge, the inability for anyone from the executive side of government to rewrite findings or to be the conduit through which findings are published. But it's your understanding that that will form a key part of the changes the Secretary of State is going to bring forward?
Yes.
Okay. And are you able to share with us the basis of that understanding? Is that through consultation with the NIO? Is that through public commentary? from the NIO?
Is that came out of the last meeting we had with the NIO just a month ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Schmidt. Commissioner, I was going to ask you the same question anyway. I can see you're keen to answer. Can I ask you for a view, please, on behalf of the Commission on the reintroduction of inquests?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think it is important to say, first of all, that there are differing views, of course, among the veteran community on the whole issue of legacy, and indeed in terms of the reintroduction of inquests. However, I'm pretty confident that the vast majority of veterans of Northern Ireland would be totally opposed to the reintroduction of inquests. I do think, though, it's very, very important for the committee to understand that the reason for the opposition is not based around any fear of past actions. It's not based around any fear of justice or the natural pursuit of justice where rules of engagement have been broken. The issue is around the fundamental unfairness of the inquest process, and that is absolutely key. If I could give one very quick tangible example, the Secretary of State recently met the sister of Patrick Kelly, who was the OC of the East Tyrone Brigade of the IRA, and the press reports indicated that the Secretary of State assured Patrick Kelly's sister that there would be an inquest into Loughgall, where Patrick Kelly lost his life as he committed in the act of terrorism. For veterans looking on to that, it's incredulous that when it comes to activities of the East Tyrone Brigade, where the inquest into that. And I recently did a podcast with a man called Glenn Espy, Ulster Defence Regiment soldier. And he makes the point that he never wore a mask. He stood out in the streets of Cookstown and did his job lawfully because he was ordered by the government to do so. And Patrick Kelly, it's widely believed, was one of the men that was involved in 2 assassination attempts on Glenn's life. He was shot both times, but survived. And he asked me as a Veterans Commissioner, where's my inquest? Where's the inquest into the literally thousands of deaths by Republicans and Loyalists? So this whole legacy process, and there's around about 33 inquests that will reopen if the current government policy plays out. Of that, only 2 are for Republican actions, and the rest are either state forces, around about 17, where a member of the security forces pulled the trigger in an incident, and the rest are by Loyalists. And when you see the overall breakdown of the deaths and the troubles, there's a fundamental unfairness to the process.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Albiston, do you have a view from the Retired Police Officers Association on the reintroduction of inquests?
We do. We have a view on that, Chair. Our view is that there's no reason why the ICRIR could not effectively discharge the responsibilities which were once envisaged for it in respect of inquests. Looking at some of the written submissions of evidence to this committee on this subject, it seems to me that you read the Dillon case in the way you want to read it, and you draw from it the bits which you like, and you ignore the bits which you don't like. And I think all sides of the argument are probably guilty of doing that. So, in principle, we say there's no reason why the Commission shouldn't undertake this responsibility. And I would defer to Axel Schmidt on the legality, as a trained lawyer, on the legal aspects of this. I think, though, there are practical difficulties, because if you're going to have an Article 2 compliant inquiry conducted under the auspices of the ICRIR, that still requires a lot of time, a lot of staff, a lot of proper evidence from civilians, retired police officers, retired soldiers, and a lot of legal expertise. So there are practical difficulties whether you have inquests or the ICRIR. I think in relation to inquests, there are problems. I won't specify particular cases, but there are certainly inquests where the views of the person conducting the inquest seemed to impinge on the way that the thing was run and to produce some rather strange, in our view, outcomes. Another problem with inquests, and it might seep over into ICRIR inquiries if they were to undertake them, but a problem that we've experienced with inquests is what you might call a sort of jigsaw identification or construction of a narrative, where particular legal firms and particular barristers participate in a series of inquests, some of which seem to them to have a similar theme. And questions are asked in an effort to try to identify security force methodology, and indeed there are ways of identifying individual members of the security forces that may have been involved, and we're a bit concerned about the way that that is handled. I understand that there are legal problems with trying to restrict that, but perhaps under the auspices of the ICRIR that might be more manageable. And finally, I'll just have a brief word on belief. The lawyers in the room will know better than I do about rational and irrational belief and objective and subjective belief and so on. And as police officers, we have a great deal of sympathy with the position in which soldiers were placed in making instant decisions. And I think this committee, if it is not aware, might be interested in some of the remarks surrounding the fatal shooting of Mr. Cabba, where some activists are now saying that subjective belief should not be a proper defence for public servants who take life in the execution of their duties, that belief should have to be rational and reasonable. Now, those are legal arguments which I'm glad to say I'm far too old and insufficiently qualified to discuss. That's for the next generation, but it's something that you might want to consider is on the horizon.
Thank you. I think that's important. And just drawing on some of the comments you made, Mr. Albiston, you talked about the coronial process and how some inquests may be infected by the person conducting the process, the coroner, and I don't think it would be helpful to talk about distinctions between individual judges in this forum. But just casting our mind back with most recent times, there were 2 inquests that were conducted by the exact same coroner, and it has been shared that there is a concern that in one inquest the coroner very clearly outlines the context, the environment in which the individuals were operating, what had happened in the preceding days in terms of other terrorist atrocities and murders, and the emotion and the concern and the apprehension surrounding all of that for the officers before the inquest. And yet, in the next inquest, by exactly the same coroner, there's no contextualisation at all. There's no recognition of what happened in the preceding days. There's no understanding of the emotion or the apprehension on the part of officers. How concerning is that for retired police officers who look to see that even in one judicial figure, there can be contextualisation to the atmosphere and operation at the time, and the next day nothing?
Well, context is certainly something that we are very aware of. In fact, one of our officers is currently researching a paper on context in relation to the Omagh bombing inquiry, because we hope that His Lordship will take full account of the context of the time and not assume that facilities were available on a certain date, which didn't actually come into play until several years later. So far as individual figures in the judiciary are concerned, I don't want to highlight individuals or pick them out, but if my remarks sound as if I'm suggesting that inquests are not being properly handled, that's not what I'm trying to say, because you can take one case recently where an inquest into an event had a report published by a coroner, and subsequently the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland published a Section 62 statement on the same incident. And if you look at the quality of the statements, the coroner is way ahead of the police ombudsman in understanding the context of the time. So there's no objection in principle to inquests at all. If the question is, can the ICRIR do the same job, the answer, I think, is yes, they can.
Thank you very much, sir.
Great, thank you. David Smith.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, gentlemen. It's good to have you with us. With ICRA, if I can. One of the things that we've found is in many submissions that we've had in both written submissions and witnesses is that there are a lot of stakeholders who struggle to trust ICRA, especially victims groups. And so I would like to ask first the Veterans Commissioner, but I would like to open this to everyone. What changes, if any, do you think need to be made to ICRA to meet the government's aspiration of increasing trust in the organisation?
Yeah. So if you answer that maybe in a slightly different way, I think part of the challenges around the legacy process in general, of which ICRA is now in focus, I'm not sure that any changes that can be made to ICRA are actually going to achieve trust. I mean, certainly we could spend time and list a number of tinkering around the edges, so to speak. Fundamentally, I don't think, as Veterans Commissioner and talking to veterans, that there's a belief among veterans that there will ever be a structure around legacy that will gain the trust or sufficient trust of the communities in Northern Ireland to make it workable. So while I agree and accept your point that there's perhaps a trust deficit, I think the view of veterans would be the ICRIR right now is the only show in town, and if not the ICRIR, even though it might be flawed in some areas and have some trust deficits, well then what? I mean, do we scrap the ICRIR and go back to the drawing board and try and produce another structure that then has to try and gain the support and the trust of the communities? And again, we could kick that down the road 5 or 6 years, come back with another iteration, and I don't think we're any further on in terms of solving this. So there are perhaps some tinkering around the edges, as I say, of the ICIR could potentially happen, but I think it is as fit for purpose as we are going to get, and I think most veterans would say engage with it, put all the look at legacy, information recovery, obviously if there is any proceedings that come out of it, then that all can be dealt with within that body, and that is the best way forward for where we are.
Thank you. Can I open that up perhaps, Chris?
Yes, thank you. I think we can look at this in two ways, in the general way and then in the specific retired police officers' factional interest way, if you like. I think in the general way, Commissioner David is implying, I think correctly, that if you can produce something which wins plaudits in one part of the community, it will automatically be opposed by another part of the community. You can think that's a sort of a negative approach, and we ought to be able to get round that. And indeed, the association has tried to encourage people to go with the proposed changes. But we accept that if it appears to certain elements that their control over the legal processes is slipping, then they will do their best to oppose it. So looking at it from a factional interest of retired police officers, how would you build trust in the RCRIR? Well, I think we've got some trust in them already through our meetings with them, and they've been very forthright. We don't agree with everything they're doing. We've explained in lengthy, wordy letters to them how we think they might improve their processes. But put very simply, what we want is fairness and due process in any system for investigating legacy issues. And whilst some people might not agree with this, our perception, the perception of retired police officers in Northern Ireland, individually and collectively, is that there has been an effort since about 1998 to denigrate the Royal Ulster Constabulary and to seek to prosecute police officers for imaginary offences. And when the DPP is having none of this, then resort is made to alternative methods of castigating the police to a lower standard of proof. And that has been done by public statements where allegations are made about the conduct of police which have not been substantiated to a level which required judicial process. And we think that due process, which has been built up over hundreds of years, should not be cast aside so quickly, simply in order to enable the castigation of a body of men and women who serve the public, we say, very well.
Could I, sorry, David, could I interrupt there? Just a quick ask from me. Would you be able to, do you think that the Northern Ireland Retired Police Officers Association would agree to publish or to share with us your lengthy and wordy letters to ICRA?
Well, I have to say, at the risk of sounding as if I've been rather lazy, some of the lengthy and wordy letters actually appears as our submission of evidence to this committee. So they say plagiarism is a terrible sin, but if you're plagiarising from yourself, I think it's perhaps more forgivable. It's about due process. If you're seeking to prosecute a retired police officer, I'll say to this committee what I've said to your predecessors, to every Secretary of State, every Security Minister, to Baroness Anderson, to all the NIO officials. Retired police officers, individually and collectively, do not wish to protect any of their colleagues who committed criminal offences from prosecution. We have no wish to do that. We have always opposed amnesty, unlike certain governments, both in London and in Dublin, who have been very generous with the amnesties which they have accorded to people. But we have never asked for amnesty for any police officer, serving or retired, who committed a criminal offence. But what we think is happening is that where you can't prove that they committed a criminal offence, you just produce a report which says, oh, well, we can't say that they committed criminal offences, but they were a jolly bad lot, and here's what they did, and all this sort of thing. And that's what we don't like. The criminal justice system has always had protections for suspected persons, and in fact from 1984 onwards all this was enshrined in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and there are processes which take place which are designed to try to prevent injustices. Sorry, I was just going to say, in relation to discipline matters, in other words, behaviour by police which doesn't reach the threshold of criminal behaviour and therefore is not a matter for the DPP, there is a discipline system. And the discipline system replicates some of the protections which appear in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And we feel that Sir Declan Morgan's proposed systems perhaps don't replicate those protections for people whose reputations are going to be damaged, even though they're not in jeopardy of a criminal prosecution. I'm sorry, Mr. Smith.
I just want to draw others in. It seems pretty unequivocal from what we're hearing is that veterans are largely in support of, there may be variety as the Commissioner said, but they're largely in support of ICRA. The government's committed to root and branch reform, and I suppose the simple question for anyone, perhaps especially Dave and Axel, who have not heard from, is if that's undertaken, do you envisage that veterans will stop supporting ICRA, and why?
I believe that to be true. There is a tacit trust in ICRA as it stands at the moment. I myself, my colleagues, there's a slight difference with the veterans from the mainland to the veterans who reside in Northern Ireland, and obviously from the Ulster Defence Regiment, etc. Because it I suppose it's a cultural thing, as well as whether you reside there or you reside here, and the way the job was done. The slight differences in what they had to do. There is a tacit trust. We have met with Sir Declan Morgan and had very open and frank discussion. And from those meetings, we believe that ICRA is trustworthy. There is trust there. It's tacit because until you actually, until you get the evidence, you are making an opinion. The opinion is there is a tacit trust as it stands. The worry is, with a root and branch reform, will ICRA be ICRA as it stands at the moment? And the answer there, I feel, is no.
Thank you, David. Axel, would you like to add to that?
Well, from the very start, when the Act was enacted, it was very clear that it still was work in progress. And even the court mentioned that, the trial judge mentioned that his view was wait and see, in the sense that Sir Declan Morgan with the Independent Commission were going to think through the system, the processes, and add to the Act whatever procedures, guidance was necessary to be produced. Now, the key principle, and I have it here in front of me, mentioned by the Independent Commission and obviously supported by Sir Declan Morgan, is that is compliance with the European Convention for Human Rights. That's their first principle. So if we start there, in the understanding that there is still work to be done, and obviously there is the remedial order coming in the future, and if the remedial order addresses the point that were highlighted by the trial judge and the Court of Appeal, well, then we'll have a fully compliant, human rights compliant, and European Convention compliant system. And if we get there, I think we need to trust the system as it is. We, of course, don't know what will be the outcome, but we will be sure that at this stage we will have a human rights compliant commission, and the processes will be human rights compliant. And so therefore I believe that at that stage trust should be given to the Commission, and on that basis.
So, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could. I think it's actually really important. Chris, I think, pointed to the elephant in the room regarding legacy, and specifically this discussion around the ICRIR. And yes, we can get into the mechanics and the weeds on the legalities of it all. The reality is, as far as veterans in Northern Ireland are concerned, the Republican movement has absolutely no interest in justice and truth and reconciliation for all. Their sort of continuing of their struggle, the arms struggle has stopped, but they're now using lawfare to achieve their aims. So they want selective justice. As long as it's soldiers and police, men and women in the dock, they're happy. No scrutiny on terrorists. They're happy with truth recovery, as long as it's on the state side. So while they continue their current trajectory and policy, then really the discussions around structures on legacy, I think, is somewhat mute, because it's never going to have legs to go anywhere. And that, I think, is a challenge for the Republican movement. If they are serious about a future post-violence, they have to grasp the nettle, and they have to stop this demonisation that Chris rightly pointed to, this demonisation of those who wore the uniform, who went out to save life, protect property, didn't go out with balaclavas, didn't go out to cold-bloodedly murder people, and therefore there has to be a recognition that they need to change their tactics going forward.
And in the light of that picture you paint, do you have any concerns with the ICRA's investigations, their approach to investigations?
No, I think, as I said earlier, I think most veterans would be willingly support ICRA. I've met Sir Declan Morgan a number of occasions. I think he's a man of integrity. I think he is doing his best to make his contribution to society in Northern Ireland. So I echo what Chris said. You know, where a soldier has went outside rules of engagement, then they should be held accountable. There's no concerns or pushback on that. I think fundamentally the issue is soldiers were sent here lawfully, under military law, given rules of engagement to operate under, and believed that if they kept within those rules of engagement, they had nothing to worry about. And now, 50 years on, they are being examined by civilian legal system, which I have to say in Northern Ireland is certainly a question mark over its independency, and perhaps it's biased in terms of how it views the situation in Northern Ireland. And therefore veterans feel it's just fundamentally unfair to have a civilian coroner try and get into the mind of a soldier or a policeman or woman who's making a split-second decision of whether or not to take life. That's not who can adjudicate whether they've kept, laws of armed conflict or rules of engagement.
Thank you. Should we best move on to?
Okay, thank you. Katrina Murray.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all gentlemen for coming today. As you'll appreciate, the committee has been speaking to a number of organisations and a number of approaches, and whilst Commissioner Johnstone, you referred to ICRA process as the only show in town, we're also considering other provisions and certainly other suggestions. So I want to go back to the provisions of the Stormont House Agreement. A suggestion that has been made to us is that we should consider being able to separate the investigative processes that existed within those, so that investigation processes sit separately to the truth-seeking processes, with two very distinct, very firewalled bodies. Whilst focusing on for all of you, would this be a process that would work for the veterans community, or particularly something that would be able to build a level of trust within it?
So thank you for the question. I think in an ideal world where you could separate out truth recovery and the other aspects of that, I think that would be good, ideally. But I suppose we are where we are, where right now both those processes play out within the structures of the ICRIR. I suppose if there was an ability to silo them some way within ICRA, that would be preferable, because I think there's definitely a crossover if the same people are looking at the facts from the past, but coming at it looking for a different perspective. I think that does lead to a contamination of the outcome. So if that answers your questions, ideally separate them out, but currently they're in ICRA, and I don't think there's any real possibility that they will be separated out.
Mr. Holmes.
I think, like David said, there's an ideal world, and unfortunately we don't live in an ideal world. There would be a duplication of effort. There would be a duplication of process, investigation, interview. One of the things I can see from that is veterans will be, I've already done this. I did this back in 1972, 73, 74, when I give my post-action report. I have answered questions over the years, and I've now got, I'm trying to engage, and I've now got two bodies asking very much the same questions from a slightly different direction. We're talking about men here, veterans and retired police officers who will be in their, depending on when it happens, 60s, 70s, 80s, going through this again. A lot do not want to be going through this again. A lot of people have they've made their peace with what happened. And it's bringing up memories, and they are being, you've now got two bodies. Then you would have two bodies looking at it from a different perspective, going down exactly the same lines again. And I don't think that's something that the veteran, to hold it all in one place with ICRA as it stands at the moment, it's fine. There is the trust in that. To then split it out into two bodies, how do you how do you separate and change your not change your answers? That's not correct. How do you phrase your answers to satisfy the two different bodies without muddying the waters, as it were? Because obviously they will be asking the questions in different ways. And as I say, it's a duplication of effort. It's just going to prolong what happens, and ultimately, I suppose, it's also going to cost a lot more money, which is, something that has been spent in millions and millions of pounds. I believe my colleague David here has looked at that. It's about £350 million I read the other day, and we've really got nowhere. And it's, I suppose you can use the expression, it's only money. The cost doesn't matter, but the cost ultimately does matter, both from a financial point of view and the cost on people's lives.
Mr. Albiston.
Yes, we take the view that the ICRIR could handle both these investigations and truth recovery, but we wouldn't be opposed to the separation of those things. I think there are problems because if one body is to do both jobs, we have said, and you'll have seen reference to this in our written submission, that there's a danger of crossover between different functions, and that can lead to contamination of people who are going to make determinations almost of a judicial nature further down the line. So there are difficult issues there, and one way of dealing with that might be to say, well, you have to have two separate bodies. But that probably doesn't solve the problem, because if you have information recovery or truth recovery, your recovery of the truth may lead you to find things that would require a different type of investigation, and then you'd be switching backwards and forwards. I don't think the answer is to go back to what was being proposed a decade ago in terms of the Stormont House agreement. Certainly the association took a very strong view on the proposals around the historical inquiries team, which seemed to be to us to be a terrible mess, and our view in the last few years was that the proposals for the ICRIR was such an enormous improvement on what had been proposed 10 years ago. One last thing about truth recovery is that there are great advantages to truth recovery, and a lot of people may get a lot of comfort from knowing what actually happened. But there are a lot of people in Northern Ireland who will be find it most uncomfortable if certain truths are recovered, made public. Little Jimmy down the street, he was a tout after all. I'm sure of it now that I've seen this thing here. Little Jimmy's family will have to move out. There are all sorts of things that can go wrong with truth recovery. And whilst, maybe there are philosophical reasons why truth is always the best thing, I think there are dangers in Northern Ireland.
Mr. Schmidt.
I think there is a logic in what has been proposed in the Act 2023. How do we review a case, historical case? Well, we start first trying to find out all the information. That's what the ICRIR is about. They are going to be able and to have unfettered access to all the information available. Having that in hand, there are then three possible processes. The first one is the family answer examination. That will go no further. In other words, answers will be provided to the families on the basis of what would have been recovered. The second one is the liability focus examination, that leading to prosecution. That means there is more information available which offer the possibility of prosecution. And then the last one is the culpability focus examination. In other words, there is there information but not possibility to prosecute. However, there is the possibility at some stage maybe to release, for example, the name of those who were the perpetrators of act of terrorism. So there is a logic that is implemented by the Commission and which we support. The other possibility would be to create some kind of commission which would be like the Independent Commission for the Location of Victim Remains. We have constantly opposed this proposal. And why? Because the Independent Commission for the Location of Victim Remains, as you know, has led to a lot of digging, not only in the Republic of Ireland, but also in France. And most of the time, or on several occasions anyway, the remains were never found. And therefore, we only knew that the information provided to this commission was right when the body was found. Now, if we have this same commission being set up to find out truth about what happened in the past, there will be no way to check that the information is right or wrong. And for that reason, we have opposed it, and my understanding is that the Secretary of State is not too keen to have that reintroduced.
Okay.
Just
yes,
thank you, Chair. Thanks everyone for being here today. Some of you I know and have talked to on many occasions. I suppose it's just to take it back to Katrina's question about truth recovery. I have some real concerns about the truth recovery. It's very clear that there are some people in Northern Ireland and further afield that are wanting to equivocate terrorists with those who served in the security forces, and that really concerns me. I think it's really important that both yourself, David, and Chris have said clearly today that you have no fear whatsoever of people who have acted outside of the law being made amenable for that. And that would be my own view as well. During the Troubles, the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland rejected terrorism. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. and the record shows that clearly at the time. I fear now that if a truth recovery process was to start and commence, that there would be those who would be very keen to rewrite themselves as heroes. And if we are dealing with people who were part of terrorist organisations or prescribed groups coming forward, who is going to verify that? You know, who is going to verify that? There literally will be nobody to verify that unless we're relying on other terrorists to mark the homework of other terrorists, which to me, and the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, is completely repugnant, regardless of political opinion. To me, that would be a real fear that I would have. Would any of you share that fear?
Yes.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's often said that in any situation such as we experienced in Northern Ireland, every individual who lives through it will have their own perception of what went on and what happened. And I have no doubt that there are many people in Northern Ireland whose view of the last 50 years will be very different from mine. And my concern is that if you go into the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, or if you go onto Google and you try to find references to the dreadful C word, collusion, you will be bombarded with a lot of nonsense, a lot of complete myth and fallacy. And what we need to do is, if we're going to have an official record, it's got to be properly managed and properly monitored. And I think it's been said, certainly in front of perhaps not this committee but its predecessors, that rather than have lawyers create the history of legacy, can't we have historians to create the history of legacy? Because historians, we hope, might have a different view.
I certainly concur. Source of what you've said there, I think what comes to mind is a fellow soldier that I talked to in January about this whole legacy issue, and sort of taking what you've just said there and giving a tangible example of a veteran's feelings, which will align with what you've just said. As a man I've known since I joined the Royal Irish in 1988, he then went on to the Ulster Defence Regiment, lives in a border area. You know, his community has suffered terribly at the hands of Republican terrorists. And I asked him, on taking up this post, what's your view on legacy? And I got a totally different answer than I expected. So this is, as I say, someone who walked in the shoes of the people we're talking about. He looked me in the eye and he said, David, regarding legacy, justice, forget about it. We are never going to see the terrorists in Northern Ireland, loyalist and Republican, in the dock and facing justice. Forget about it. He then went on to say, accountability, forget about it. No British government, Tory or Labour, is ever going to hold Sinn Féin particularly to account for the part that the wider Republican movement played. There's just no appetite by successive British governments to hold the terrorists to account in Northern Ireland. What he then did say is the history of the Troubles is the key. We cannot allow the rewriting of what happened. We cannot allow our children to be taught a false narrative that somehow those who wore the uniform and went out to save life are demonised, and those who went out with the intent of murder and who literally slew thousands somehow are heroes. That cannot be allowed to happen. And he was passionate about that, and I think he speaks for many, many veterans, and probably all veterans, which concurs with exactly what you just said.
Yeah. Okay, Gavin Robinson.
Thanks very much, Chair. Mr. Albiston, you were talking earlier in answer to Ms. Murray about people's perceptions and how two individuals who come from different backgrounds could read the same material and will take from it what they wish. And you will know from your experience in Northern Ireland that since the Belfast Agreement, there's an awful lot of linguistic gymnastics, having to accept things that really jar, but you're asked to accept them through the prism of equality and parity of esteem and understanding other people's perspectives, walking a day in the life in the shoes of someone else. Could I ask you for your position and the retired police officer's position on, whilst these things seemingly apply to everyone, there seems to be an incapacity for them to apply to former police officers. And this inquiry has heard not only from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, but from a panel last week with a former police ombudsman and a current chief constable of the police, suggesting that it is somehow inappropriate for individuals who have a past in policing to form part of the staff complement of the ICRIR.
I think, thank you. I think I would like to answer that question in two parts. Do the suitability of recruitment second, and the first bit about what happened after 1998. I think, to be honest, the association which I represent and many individuals in it, and I am as guilty, if not more guilty, I am as guilty as any of this. There was a certain naivety. I was a senior officer under Ronnie Flanagan at the time of now Lord Patton's review. And we, as a senior officer team, supported the Chief Constable in supporting the implementation of a lot of changes. And there was a lot of hurt about the changes to the name and the badge and all the rest of it. But we, as a leadership group, and we tested the feelings of the people we were leading, thought that we want the next 25 years to be rather better than the last 25 years, and if we have to make certain sacrifices which we don't think are entirely fair or just, then that may be a price to pay. And I think we were naive because I don't think we saw the way that the next 25 years were going to go. And what I mean by that is that it's often quoted, the figure, that deaths during the troubles, the conflict, whatever euphemism you want to give to the period of terrorism, were caused 60% by Republicans, 30% by loyalists, 10% by the security forces, and whereas the security force deaths are up for examination, the other 90 were clearly wrong, and nobody says that they were right. And I think what has been happening is that the Republican movement have decided to allocate the 30% of deaths caused by the loyalists to the state, because the state was running all the loyalist organisations. There was this massive collusion taking place. And if they can persuade the people in the bars of Philadelphia and Boston and all the rest of it that actually the figure isn't 60-30-10, it's 60-40, then you start to rewrite history, you start to produce this narrative that it was a conflict and that there was equal merit on either side, as Ms. Eastwood has alluded to, that there was a sort of moral equivalence. Well, there wasn't a moral equivalence, not at all. On the recruitment side, I did watch the discussion in this forum. I accept that there is a strong case for saying no former RUC officer should be involved in investigations into legacy, but I don't agree with it. And the reason why I don't agree with it is that where you have an absence of experience and knowledge, you can sometimes produce reports which appear to be naive or misguided. Now, that's not the same thing as prosecutions, because prosecutions depend on evidence. And in relation to the criminal justice system, what the DPP is looking for is not an opinion. He's looking for evidence which has got a reasonable prospect of convicting somebody of a criminal offence. But where you get reports, and everyone in this room knows that the Section 62 statements published by a succession of police ombudsmen are a bit of a bête noire to the Retired Police Officers Association, because we see in them a failure to understand, as well as, it has to be said, a bias in the approach and in the outcome. Mr. Boucher had a very pure investigation team and a pure set of writers writing his interim report. And he came up with some peculiar conclusions. So I think there's a problem. If you're going to be so pristine clean and not have any of the dirty RUC involved in your investigations, then you're going to possibly run into trouble.
Yeah, and I mean, it has been raised since that evidence session that we had, because there was a bit of surprise, particularly given that a lot of this seems to focus around one or potentially two individuals and is quite personal actually, and doesn't feel legal, safe or sensible to me, and certainly not to others within any normal course of how you engage in these discussions. That within the Operation Canova team there was an investigatory oversight board that had a member, former police ombudsman on it, who was also a member of the RUC Police Authority. But one jump to the next clearly didn't compromise their personal integrity in a way that is being suggested in this case. That the chief constable making these remarks is appointed by a policing board that has former terrorists sitting on that policing board and the recruitment panel, and their personal or professional integrity is not in some how questioned. And yet we have this conundrum being put to us today, but the main thrust of the argument wasn't that they were accurate about the view there would be a contamination of approach or some lack of professionalism, but that there could be a perception. It was all based around perception, or you could substitute that with prejudice. So I wonder, from your association, and then I'll open it up, is there not a stronger need for the Northern Ireland office, because they're responsible for these structures, to push back against misguided, ill-informed or deeply prejudicial perception?
Well, our view, Mr. Robinson, through the chair, is if a police officer has integrity and you trust them and you let them work in the police, do they suddenly lose that integrity when they go to work for another body doing the same sort of job that they did when they're in the police? I would say no. I would say take the expertise. If you have a doubt about the integrity of a particular individual, challenge them or don't recruit them. I felt very uncomfortable with the discussion which I was watching, because I know the individual involved, and this is a man of integrity. But that's not the issue. I mean, you could take the same issue and say, well, hang about, why have you got, as a Chief Commissioner, a man who was previously the Lord Chief Justice? Surely he can't be independent, because he's already been involved in the judicial system of Northern Ireland at quite a high level, shall we say. So I found some of the discussion which took place from this table on that day to be not very fair or accurate.
No, thank you.
Can I just come in there a minute? I mean, you mentioned, Gavin, the policing board. I mean, it's not the Chief Constable that decides the policing board, it's the political parties.
Correct.
Yeah.
My point is that he is appointed to that role, and you can hear the support for this point. My point is that he is appointed to the role of Chief Constable through a panel comprised of a former member of the IRA.
Okay. Just wait a minute till we close the windows.
But it's nice to get support for my point from time to time.
Maybe they would disagree then.
Do you mind if we open that up? Sorry, you want to deal with this one?
No, I just like to ask Chris what engagement you've had with, if any, with Chief Constable Boucher and Sir Ian Livingston?
Well, I personally have had limited contact. Since he was appointed Chief Constable, Mr. Boucher has had meetings with us as retired police officers, at the first of which he objected to a letter which I sent to the newsletter about his Canova report. When he was the head of Canova, as Sir Ian is now, a colleague of mine has had regular meetings and updates, and indeed my colleague has given advice. Now, perhaps that's not what people want to hear, that Canova was corrupted by a retired police officer giving advice, but there are things which are known to us which you will not discover by looking through dusty books or old corrupted computer files. There are clues that can be given that will point you in the right direction. There is information about context that you might need if you're conducting an inquiry of the type that Mr. Boucher was conducting and that Sir Ian Livingston is now conducting.
One of the things that fascinates me is that you mentioned it a lot earlier about the discipline system within PACE and how it's different in ICRA. It seems that in Northern Ireland things are done differently from the rest of the UK. I mean, is that right?
Well, the principles of the criminal law are very similar, and the experiences of victims, witnesses and suspects will be very similar. The point I was trying to make was that in relation to the behaviour of police, which may attract public criticism, but which does not constitute a criminal offence, which for serving police officers is the discipline system, has a parallel set of protections which are designed to enable a complainant to have their case properly heard, properly investigated, and to have an accused officer afforded similar, but not exactly the same, similar rights to a suspect in a criminal investigation. So that when you come to a disciplinary hearing, which is the equivalent of a judicial hearing, you've got what Mr. Schmidt would probably call Article 6 equality of arms. It's fairness. But what we were saying about the HIT was a classic example, but we feel that even ICRIR is not going down the equality of arms path, because they will have investigations which may start out as criminal investigations and veer off into what they call liability or culpability investigations, in which deceased police officers could be criticised without ever having had a chance to address the issue which is put. Their families get very hurt by this sort of thing, and then you've got very elderly police officers, and I've met many of these who've come to me because they've had letters saying they're going to be criticised in this or that forum, and what can they do about it, because what's being said here isn't right. And they get a letter which it is supposed Maxwellisation. They're given 30 days to respond to a discussion on an event which took place 40 years ago, after an investigation by a body which has maybe lasted 15 or 16 years, and suddenly they've got 30 days to think about it and defend their reputations. This is what we've got to get past, and this is why we thought with the ICRIR we might have the chance of a new beginning. And if indeed, as Mr. Smith was saying earlier, there's going to be a fundamental change to it, then we would want to see the changes to include proper protections for people who are going to be criticised. Not an inability to name names when a terrorist commits an offence, but a protection for the reputations of people, many of whom are dead and many of whom are very old, and get quite upset when the knock comes on the door because they don't know what it's all about. And you probably would accept if I say to you that most retired police officers want to help. They still have the ethos which they had when they were serving. And sometimes they're tempted to try and remember things which they don't actually remember. And they forget their police training, which is if you don't know the answer, say, I don't know the answer. And they think they're helping the investigator by trying to remember things which they don't actually remember at all. So there are all sorts of things that go wrong, and you've got to have a proper system in place to ensure that you don't make these mistakes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Apologies.
Chair. Really just for other panellists
Okay.
at this stage to outline your view of perception and whether it is important to consider families' perception of independence or lack thereof, but then to contextualise that and whether the NIO should be stronger, in my view, in pushing back on perception based on prejudice. David?
So, Gavin, through the chair, I think you've raised a very good question. If you were looking to have a process for truth and justice, you would surely want the best resources, the best investigators, those with the most experience, be on your team to establish truth and bring justice if it was needed. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because of the tragedy of the Troubles, the RUC are exceptionally experienced in investigations and also understand the context that the Northern Ireland Troubles happened in, which are not insignificant and not irrelevant to the truth and justice process. So to not want someone of the stature of the individuals that we're speaking to in that process, when they bring the experience, they bring the knowledge, you just have to ask the question why. And I think I did allude to it earlier. There are some, unfortunately, aren't interested in actually finding the truth and justice. They have their own agenda, and therefore they will object and create obstacles that in reality wouldn't exist in any other walk of life. So I think it is important that there is pushback. Again, back to this whole process of fairness. You know, society in Northern Ireland was asked to accept unrepentant terrorists in government, those who've been convicted of crime. That had to be accepted as part of the peace process. Already alluded to, members who have been convicted involved in policing now. I've alluded to the justice system, and certainly those high up in the justice system have had political opinions very publicly expressed in the past. That all seems to be okay in legacy. Like, don't go there, don't look there. But when there's someone who has experience at the cold face of terrorism and investigating of terrorism is then involved in a process with an ICRA, all of a sudden there's objections. I mean, I think it's obvious as to why that is.
Thank you very much. Dave, anything to add?
I totally agree with that. From a point of view, from the veterans' point of view, you know, using former police who, you know, that was their job to investigate. I would say, more than in general, you know, they are trustworthy people. They are people of integrity. Whatever the outcome is, they will be like, you know, they will not try to fudge around the edges to go with an agenda, anything like that. And I think it's the ones who are doing the complaining about that are the ones who have fear of the investigation being done properly. From a point of view of the veterans, and it has been said before with the police, from the point of view of the veterans is, if somebody overstepped the mark, if they did the wrong thing, then, and that comes out, then something needs to be done. People were convicted along the lines, you know, during the years, who had overstepped the mark, had done the wrong thing. If it comes out fine, what you can't do is say, well, we don't want, you know, in essence, I suppose from some parts of the society, they would want the best investigators going after the security forces, but they don't want them anywhere near their own investigations. And there is a definite bias in there.
Good point. Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Schmidt, do you have anything to add?
No, I fully agree with what they have said, and I would support entirely their point of view. I think it's totally unfair to raise this kind of issue against very noble men who, as I said, fought for the protection, the promotion of human rights and democracy in Northern Ireland. And if there is any issue in relation, for example, to a police officer who would have known a certain case, well, he can always recuse himself. But apart from that, I will not add anything else.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Chris Blow.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, gents, as well for your evidence already. In the Commission's contributions to this committee, it says the Legacy Act does not define reconciliation, and the Commission is clear itself that it can't impose a definition. So what is your view on reconciliation being the principal objective of ICRA? And I guess the follow-up questions to that would be, how might effective reconciliation be measured, and should, if it can't, reconciliation be taken out of the Commission's purview? I don't know who wants to start. I know there's three big questions in there.
Question's far too difficult, isn't it? I would like to think that many good brains in the UK and our neighbours and friends abroad would have given some thought to this over many years, and how you achieve reconciliation after the events of the last 50 years, I'm not sure. I mean, the way that they do it in some countries is you have a Tito figure who makes sure that Serbs and Croats and so on don't go around killing each other. And that survives for a certain amount of time until the power at the centre goes. That would not be our tradition in this country. I think we have to work a lot harder at this. I don't think it's a problem for Ulster Human Rights Watch or retired police officers or military veterans to deliver reconciliation, but I think we all have a part to play. Being open and honest with people that we don't share views with might be a start. But who's going to go first? Who's going to jump first? I think this is the problem with this. It's a long-term prospect. Educationalists would have a view about how we might improve things in Northern Ireland. I think our religious leaders might have a view about how we would improve things in Northern Ireland. Speaking personally, I would far rather see taxpayers' money spent on education and that sort and the health service than on a massive security presence. We were hoping for the peace dividend, but we seem to be spending it all on lawyers, and as Mr. Boucher, I think, alluded to in his evidence. And I don't know whether this committee has considered the paper produced a few weeks ago by Policy Exchange. I know that many people here will not share the political outlook of Policy Exchange, but they produced a paper on the costs of legacy. When I discussed this with the current Secretary of State, he said, "Oh yes, well, some of their predictions for the future are a bit off. You know, they're not quite right, and they're sort of guessing in the dark." And I accept what he says, and he has better factual knowledge of these things than I do. All I would say is that some of the figures which Policy Exchange produced in relation to past inquiries were clearly underestimates, for example, in relation to the Savile inquiry and so on. And I think there is an argument which says, and in principle I would agree with it, that you can't put a price on justice. But when you move away from principles practicalities. If you want some of the elaborate mechanisms which we've been using for the last 25 years, the cost will be in investment in infrastructure. The cost will be in making sure that the roofs of the schools don't leak, which they do in many parts of Northern Ireland. There are balancing acts. Thank goodness I'm only a policeman. I don't have to make these decisions. The politicians in this room have to make these decisions about allocation of resources. And there are ways that you can improve the chances of reconciliation by the appropriate allocation of resources.
Just to pull you back to the start of the question, so are you saying that there could be no way to ever have a fully sort of accepted viewpoint of what reconciliation is, because that's at the heart of what the main thrust of what the Commission is meant to be doing? Do you think that was and we were never going to be able to reach it? Or does it evolve? Does it evolve over time?
Our association has encouraged its members to be positive, and to be positive about the prospects of reconciliation, even though we think this is difficult. And we've said publicly in our answers to questions, that the very fact that the job which has been given to the ICRIR is difficult, to put it at its lowest, should not be a reason for not trying to do it. In fact, the more difficult the task is, perhaps the more we should be trying to do it. Because if we took the view as senior officers of the RUC in 1998 that we want the next 25 years to be better than the previous 25 years, then perhaps as retired officers in 2025 we should be taking a similar view, that we'd like the next 25 years to be better than the last 25 years. And if that means making sacrifices and so on, for example, in terms of the purity of the staffing of investigative bodies, okay, let's do it if that brings confidence.
I agree, complexity shouldn't be a vice, should be a challenge. But Mr. Johnstone, do you want to respond as well? Sorry.
Yes, Chris, through the chair, I think 3 very good questions at the heart of the ICRIR. I think the whole concept around reconciliation is a noble pursuit, and is one that every right-thinking person, should be aspiring to. I suppose until there is a willingness of all parties to want to pursue reconciliation, in some ways it doesn't really matter the structures in place and the cajoling of that. Again, I'm trying not to be negative today, but I do have to reflect the views of veterans. That is my job. Sort of Chris rightly alluded there to this concept of who jumps first. I think many veterans have said to me that in 1998, the Belfast Agreement, the veterans did jump. As Chris has alluded to, the police force did jump. You could argue wider society did jump on this promise of peace, on this step towards reconciliation. We accepted terrorists in government, we accepted prisoners just having their records effectively expunged, prison doors opened back into society, and yet the veterans are not allowed to move on. They're still faced with this demonisation and this whole concept of being dragged back to never-ending inquests. So there certainly won't be reconciliation while there is this ongoing demonisation and deliberate attack upon the security forces. But we all hope that, as Chris said, 25 years on, we can get to a point of reconciliation. When I came into this post, I remember early on looking at legacy and making the comment to someone that, well, I don't think there will be reconciliation until this current generation passes away, those who lived the Troubles. Unfortunately, that view has changed, because through the inquest process, through this legacy process, we now see the children of participants of the Troubles continuing with the legal avenues that are open to them. And therefore I somewhat despair that even with the passing of everyone who was alive during the Troubles, and we're now 27 years on, and still it's headline news, still we're here at a committee such as this 27 years on. That's longer than the Troubles themselves actually happened. And yet we don't seem any closer to reconciliation. So there has to be a will of all parties to want reconciliation.
To have has this been said, to have the reconciliation, everybody has to be willing to do it, and not only do it, but do it properly. Tell the truth, because without truth there cannot be a final reconciliation. You need the truth to have the reconciliation. That's the only way that it will ever work. And there has to be the willingness. Somebody has to jump first, But when somebody jumps first, everybody else has to jump as well. You can't just have it from one side. You can't have one side willing and the other one saying, well, when you've finished, we'll start. Because no, it's not finished. We need to know about this, we need to know about that. Everybody's got to move at the same time. As soon as one starts, everybody has to get involved, and that, I think, is the big problem out there.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt.
What was the problem in Northern Ireland? What is the source of all the difficulties? Terrorism. And terrorism in a democracy is never, ever justified. And that has been the stand taken by all democracies, and of course the United Kingdom. So therefore, those who engage in terrorism were obviously on the wrong side of things. These men were on the right side of things. So what do we need? Well, we need an acknowledgement from those who engage in terrorism that what they did was wrong. And ourselves, the Ulster Human Rights Watch, have a Judeo-Christian interpretation of human rights. So therefore, if there is acknowledgement of wrongdoing, there is the door open for a change and the door open for forgiveness, which leads to reconciliation. And I think it's a very noble aim that is being pursued, to have reconciliation. And of course, it will happen in some circumstances. It will not happen in other circumstances. But one thing is for sure, is that terrorists who were terrorists must be reconciled with democracy. They must stop glorifying what they did in the past, as they still do today. And if that happens, well then, there will be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a possibility to lead to reconciliation, forgiveness and reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Dan Aldridge.
Thank you for all that you've provided us with so far. This is the last one.
Yes.
What is your view on the Irish government's engagement with legacy issues? We were in Dublin recently speaking to them about this, but I don't know whether it's an intentional wry smile on David's face. I'm just intrigued by... So if we go to David first, that would be great. Thank you.
Very, very happy to take this one on behalf of the veterans of Northern Ireland. I think the truth is that the ability of the Irish government to duck out of the legacy process thus far is probably one of the biggest scandals of legacy. Okay. The Irish state was a player in the Troubles. Over 500 murders happened along the border corridor, and those that carried out those murders either came from the Irish Republic or went back into the Irish Republic after committing their acts of terrorism. The biggest single loss of life in the Troubles, 18 British soldiers blown up at Narrow Water. Those bombs were detonated from the Irish Republic, and yet the response from the Irish government and this whole legacy process has been woefully inadequate. Woefully inadequate. From a veteran's point of view, why is it that veterans are held to a standard? I mean, you have the Irish government taking the British government a legal process over legacy. And I think it's certainly time veterans feel that the British government start to demand the same scrutiny that they have to go through. That's just fundamental. And collusion was mentioned by Chris, and again, he has certainly lost colleagues as a result of collusion from organisations within the Irish Republic. And yet again, if you talk about collusion in terms of legacy, it seems to be only a focus on so-called and allegations of British state collusion. There's collusions on both sides. So the Irish government, and Sir Declan Morgan has been very clear on this, under the Belfast Agreement, the Irish government did commit to engaging with the recovery of information and disclosing relevant information. They have not lived up to their commitments. And from a veteran's point of view, it is definitely time that they came forward and that they engage with this process and they provide the information that's necessary to have a complete picture of the troubles.
Dave, do you?
I will. I have to be very honest here, and I will actually defer to David on that. To be honest with you, he has said what I was going to say and more. You know, that the Irish state was a player. It's very obvious, and it was also a safe haven, and it was a safe haven with the Irish state's permission.
Thanks, Dave. Chris, do you have?
Chair, at the policing level, there's always been cooperation between the Royal Ulster Constabulary and Garda Síochána, and I'm sure that cooperation continues with the PSNI. It's partly a product of political agreements and so on, but more than that, it is the product of the natural camaraderie which exists between police officers in different jurisdictions, because they recognise people who are doing a job which is similar to theirs. Are they experiencing the same difficulties? There's a culture, you know, no police officer could make a decision to save his life, all judges are useless, all these sort of little cultural things are shared between different police forces. But at the political level, I have to say that I was rather astonished at the interstate action, which, as I understand it in my non-lawyer's reading, is a suggestion that the British government was attempting to introduce amnesty, which was contrary to the European Convention, and therefore the Irish government felt obliged to do something about it. Well, they didn't do very much about it when the British government was giving letters of comfort and reducing prison sentences for the most heinous crimes to 2 years. They didn't do very much about it in relation to their own jurisdiction in the period between 1922 and 1998. So I think there's a difference between the practicalities and the politics of this. If you're in government in Dublin, there are a number of different constituencies which you have to manage, just as you ladies and gentlemen sitting around this table, you know, when you're in your own constituencies and managing your party associations, or when you're in the House of Commons. So, you know, I don't belittle the job which politicians down south do, but I do think that it's a bit of a cheek to take the UK government to the International Court over an issue in which they are hardly guiltless themselves.
Thanks, Chris.
I would entirely agree with what Chris has said. There is, in fact, very little, if anything, that is being produced by the Republic of Ireland in order to facilitate any form of investigation or even information truth recovery in the Republic of Ireland. We have to deal with a number of cases which are cross-border cases, and we basically don't get anything. Now, Chris has mentioned camaraderie between police forces. Yes, that's always possible, but what really is needed and is required from the Republic of Ireland is for them to do exactly the same as is going to be done here. That is, here the information, the Independent Commission will have unfettered access to all the information, material, etc., which will be in the hand of the security forces, MI5, MOD, etc. They should themselves provide by some form of processes unfettered access to what they have in relation to all the cross-border cases that have been mentioned and the 500 people who were murdered over the border. So if we have that, well then yes, we will be able to sort out a number of cases. But if we don't, we're going to be left without having the possibility to have the essential information that will allow to resolve many of these cases.
Thanks, Axel. You touched on some practicalities there, and ICRA's Chief Commissioner has called for the Commission's information gathering powers to be extended to Ireland. I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts on how that could possibly work, and could negotiating an agreement with Dublin delay the introduction of all the other measures, and is that something that we should be considering?
I think you're tempting me as a policeman into the area of international relations, in which I would tread even more warily than I did in certain parts of Northern Ireland. This is an issue which I think the House of Commons is going to have to address, and it's pertinent also to Lord Turnbull's inquiry into the Omagh bombing, because so much of the evidence which would be relevant to the matters which he's considering can only come from full cooperation by the Republic of Ireland. And certainly I think if the Commission remains in existence and Sir Declan continues to be Chief Commissioner, he will be looking for a great deal from the Republic. But he can only get what the politicians negotiate with their counterparts in the Republic.
You else want to come in on that? No. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Albiston, Mr. Johnstone, and Mr. Holmes. Thank you for your time today. Order.